in the digital divide. Also wanted to thank our co-chairs for helping us still work on this event even during unprecedented times like this. So a shout out to Elizabeth Corley, Chris Light, Denise Wales, and Katie Cheney, who are the workgroup co-chairs for the two work groups involved in this event. So thank you for, as always, for helping us out. So just a quick little thing from SID-W, and also just to lay the ground rules for the event. So I'm a senior programs manager here at SID Washington, and help set all these events up. So just for those who aren't familiar with us, we're a neutral convener in events and membership-based organization whose purpose is to be a convener and bring people together to talk about international development issues. So this is our bread and butter. We host a whole bunch of events like this. We will post all the bios and the event flyer in the chat box, so be on the lookout for that. But you'll see, all the events that we're doing. We have a few events coming up. So if you see, you can check out the website for more information. I know Katie and Denise will mention their next upcoming event on disability inclusion. So check that out as well if you're interested in that. And so I will not take up too much more time, but I'll just mention quickly the ground rules. So for those, for everyone else, we're going to be muting everyone except for the speakers and SID-W staff. So we'll be in touch. Just if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box and introduce yourself if you'd like to. And then if you are on the phone, it might be a little bit trickier if you're trying to type in questions. Particularly, we ask as I said, all questions to be in the chat box. If you are on the phone, feel free to there will be a raise your hand feature. If you look in the on your app, if you have a smartphone. So just use that function. That should be pressing the pound sign and 9 to raise your hand, so we'll be able to call on you if you ask a question. And if you want to mute and unmute yourself, the command is #6. So you can use those functions on your keypad to be able to do those things. And we will, if you're having issues, we can also mute you on your mute or unmute you from our end as well. So if you have any questions about that, just let us know. And then the last thing I'll mention too, if you have any questions for the speakers, or if you'd like to pose a poll to the whole audience today, as I said, feel free to put those into the chat box throughout the event. SID-W staff will be checking the chat box to make sure we address all your questions throughout. So we'll save those until the very end, and we will ask them at the very end. With that, I will hand it off to our workgroup coach. We'll hand it off to our workgroup co-chairs to get us started. So I'll start with Katie and Denise.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Katie Cheney. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Gender and Inclusive Development Work Group, along with Denise Wales. We're so excited to be partnering with the ICT and Development Work Group today on this fascinating event. I do want to mention quickly that we have another event coming up April 10th on putting disability inclusion at the center of our work, with speakers from USAID, Humanity and Inclusion, Save the Children, and Global Campaign for Education. So I hope some of you can join us for that event as well. And now over to our ICT co-chairs.
So Chris or Elizabeth?
Yeah, this is Elizabeth. I'm the ICT for Development co-chair. It's wonderful to see everyone. Welcome. We're really looking forward to this panel. We did want to make an announcement. Chris, would you like to tell the group about the position?
Sure. Regrettably, we're going to be replacing Elizabeth. Her tenure is up, so we're looking for a new co-chair.
Yes, and the way people can apply is by sending an email to SID, or is the application all online?
You can, so for the application, if anybody's interested, you can email us at it's workgroups, WORKGROUPS at SID-W.org, And all you have to do is send a resume, cover letter, just explaining, just detailing your interest in the event, in the position, and contact information for 2 professional references if you are interested. Please do that.
Okay, very good. And for those of you who are also on Twitter, you can reach us at @SID-Washington, and it's hashtag SID-W Live. I'm delighted to be with you and to kick off the series on inclusion. This is part of a 4 or 5 part series. We're starting off with gender and the digital divide with our other co-chairs, as you heard. And first, I'd like to start by introducing the first speaker, Revi Sterling. She is with USAID's Women Connect Challenge, which focuses on the use of technology to create new social norms to empower women. And before that, Revi was the chief of party at Net Hope, where she directed Women and Web Alliance. And prior to that, Revi started the first information and communications technology for development professional master's program in the United States. And that was at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So we have a real expert, somebody who's been on the forefront for a long time, and I'm eager to hear about her comments on gender and the digital divide. Revi?
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me just fine? Fabulous. Okay, I got some thumbs up. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a really nice intro. It's truly an honor to be invited to speak at a SID-W event. I thank all the SID-W staff that put this together and helped us really make this, hopefully this next hour and a half special, especially Chris Light and Jennifer Johnson, who initiated the idea of having this talk in the very first place. So I'm super excited. Also, it's fun to see just the participant window and see long lost friends like Beth and Dee Dee and Davina and Mercedes. And it's just, it's a little bit like the old home week. So it's good that we are all in this situation, maybe. And a lot of names that I don't recognize. So thank you for being interested in the gender digital divide. And let's move on to slide 1. I thought someone was doing slides. There we are. Okay, perfect. So slide 1, okay, there's not much to go into this with. Of course, with the 179 targets from the SDGs, one of them is target 5B, which is promoting the empowerment of women through information and communication technology. And it's interesting because ICT is really only mentioned 4 times in all of the targets. And so again, as we've got lots of ICT and development people here, that's just something to keep in mind, the lack of representation in technology, in development. I'm putting my contact information up here. We'll close with this slide because I have sort of a call to action for you, but I just put a brief web page up at this lovely vanity URL, revisterling.com, that just lists about 20 or 30 of the most cited and really the only existing gender digital divide resources that are out there. So feel free to take advantage of that. And then we'll come back to the slide later so you can grab my email for my call to action. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a slide to sort of set the stage on what the gender digital divide is. I'm sure most people have heard of the digital divide, obviously the haves and the have-nots in the digital economy and ecosystem. But the gender divide speaks specifically to the unique barriers that women face, women and girls. I'll probably just say women because I'm used to that, but this certainly does include girls, and girls certainly are a very unique subset within women and girls with their information needs and requirements for levels like privacy, education, etc. But in this talk, I'll probably just say women, so please excuse my lack of inclusivity. But really, the gender digital divide, reflects these inequalities that are everywhere between men and women in terms of technology access and use. I'm putting some stats up here, also some pictures of women that I work with directly. But there seems to be, most of what I'm going to talk about today hinges on this unbalanced equation, which is that we know that women's advancement is a key to poverty alleviation in all forms. We've known that since the 50s and 60s, all sorts of quantitative and qualitative literature. We also know that digital technology can be a huge, powerful tool in poverty alleviation. So you've got these two force multipliers that should work well together. If you add women and technology, you think we could really do a wonderful set of efforts worldwide to promote women's empowerment, community development, sustainable development. And yet, women do not have the same access to technology use as men do for a variety of cultural and socioeconomic reasons. And moreover, if women keep being excluded from the benefits of technology access and use, they're going to be further marginalized. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. This is kind of my doom and gloom slide, and I don't mean to put anybody in a bad mood, but this is just the reality of the fact that, there are probably about 1 billion women who have never been online. And by that, I mean, let's just, using the GSMA standard of mobile internet use. And so we've got over 1 billion women that have never been online, and yet you have all of this digital development happening across every development sector. So if you have a gender digital divide, and I'll talk about how it's actually growing, which seems anathema to a lot of digital development, but it actually is true. It's really a critical failure on the part of people doing digital development if they're not looking specifically at why so many women may not be able to access their interventions. And this is not just me saying this as a researcher. This is, organizations like the Wall Street Journal, and the fact that some of the communities that I work in across the Sahel have local fatwas against women's technology use. And there's hundreds of villages across 3 states in India that have banned women's cell phone use. It's a jailable offense. It also is, punishments are sanctioned by beatings and divorce even. So this is the reality for a lot of the women that aren't online. And they aren't online because there are simply people in their communities that don't want them to be. Now, when you are online, if you take a look at the 3 slides in the bottom, look at these phones and this internet cafe. So this internet cafe, quote unquote, there is no coffee there, is one terminal in northern Uganda at an ISP that I've been working with for a few years. And this is the community's window to the internet. It's a 3x4 computer running, I think that might be Windows 8 based on the background. But that's not the kind of environment that's necessarily going to lend itself to a lot of e-learning and agriculture and a rich, immersive technology experience, or really any privacy if that's all you have. Then you have this 2 handsets from women that I work with, and you'll notice that these are not smartphones. These are feature phones, which 80% of women in developing countries have feature phones, not smartphones. And the ubiquitous rubber band around them, because that's really sort of their pop socket or their holder for those phones. These are the form factors that people have. And yet we're designing these very, very advanced digital development solutions and really missing the mark on meeting women where they're at. So next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about closing. I've established that there is a gender digital divide, but I want to talk about how, the good news here is we can close it. We've looked at other divides in the digital and in the gender and development space and have been able to address them, such as supporting the girl child to go to school, supporting efforts to stop FGM and female circumcision, efforts to stop girls being sold into early, marriage, etc. So there is hope in this space. We just actually have to be a lot smarter as sociologists and social scientists than just technologists. So the gender digital divide has actually been growing. And if you look at the ITU broadband report, etc., it's really in response to the fact that technology is coming along faster. It's becoming more powerful, and because it's an advanced, modern, powerful tool, there are a lot of people in communities, husbands, fathers, mother-in-laws, religious figures, employers, who see that as a threat to the status quo. People in power don't necessarily like to give up power. and they certainly don't necessarily like to give it up to women. So the reason, and this has been since technology first started coming to communities, and I started doing research, we're not there yet, first started doing research in around the 1998 timeframe, when telecenters and some mobile phones were coming to communities, was that it was going to the men, and it was going to the power brokers in the community, and women were literally being left offline because not only did they not have the skills and the literacy, but they were told the content wasn't relevant, that they weren't smart enough for this. And I hear this all the time, that, I'm too dumb to use my phone doesn't speak my language, my husband says I'll break it, etc. So it's not that we haven't tried to close the gender digital divide. Lots of technology companies, foundations, multilaterals, NGOs have tried for a long time. But what I would say is that their efforts have been sorely misdirected in terms of trying to just interact at the skills level. Bring in computers, teach women for a few weeks, send them out. Now they've got some skills in Microsoft Office, or they've been to a hackathon, etc. When these aren't, these are not relevant cross-cutting skills that are going to actually close the gender digital divide. And we'll get into that in a little bit more. But you had maybe 12, 15 years of really good funding in this space by funders and donors, and they didn't see the return on investment. They didn't see a lot of women entering the workforce in these communities, et cetera. And that's because we're just not understanding what the actual needs are, which is working at that social norms level. Again, the implications of this are grave, because as more and more content becomes digitalized in sectors like WASH and agriculture and education and health, and if fewer women can access it, then we're not doing equitable development. And if we're not doing equitable development, I would argue we're not really doing development. This is the reason why I've been a huge fan. This is really why I came to DC to work on this issue in the form of the Women Connect Challenge, which I will talk about a little bit later. So next slide. So I'm not saying that you're bad if you do an ICT and gender programming. If you do skills training, if you teach women how to use mobile phones, all of that is very interesting. But there's really some other questions to ask. And these are the questions that guided how I formed the Women Connect Challenge at USAID, which was, who isn't at your tech training? Who isn't showing up? Because those are the women that are so underempowered that they can't even, they don't have the family support, they don't have the resources to have someone else watch their kids, they need to be, maybe they're homebound, etc. So who isn't coming? Because those are the women that I think we need to reach more than anything. They're the ones that stay in the community, they're the ones that are responsible for really development at the family and community level. The real big question with so many of these issues is, under what conditions in restrictive environments could women and girls be allowed to use technology? Are these reasonable definitions? Can we create reasons? Can we create compelling use cases that says to that cleric or that husband or that mother-in-law, we understand that you're worried about women online and what will happen and how immoral of a space it is and all these kind of things that you're concerned about. However, have you thought about allowing her to get content on children's health or maternal content so your next baby doesn't die, et cetera? So bringing it down to that level of understanding that it may take baby steps for women to be able to access all of the content out there and services, but we have to start with those little cracks in the exterior and then start to exploit them. Can technology actually leapfrog women's empowerment initiatives? It doesn't have to be on this very slow trajectory of empowerment. I'll talk about a case with a community network, which is like a local internet service provider that's run by local rural village women. This community didn't have any internet at all. The women brought it in. The men are thrilled they have internet. No one is concerned that women have brought this in. In fact, they're very thankful about it. And now the internet is really seen as a woman's utility and tool that they've brought to the rest of the community. And it's a huge gift and a huge boon. There's also, a lot of literature, and we're trying to find this out really at a evidence-based level through some of the RCTs and other things that we're doing, but to societal concerns such as environmental concerns, pollution, corruption, gender-based violence. If you can report that, if you can be an activist, do you take that to an online forum so that you actually are encouraging the use of technology around larger societal programs? Is that a big draw? And then, of course, there's the upstream and downstream support of putting technology in the hands of women. What are the conditions that we need to meet in order for women to successfully be online? And then what do we have down the road? Are there jobs? What do they do when they run out of minutes that were subsidized by IBM or Microsoft, et cetera? So really trying to be mindful of those things. Next slide. Okay, so none of this can be successful unless we really look at the social norms. And, I've talked quite a bit about the fact that we really have to uncover these core issues and these fears about what it means to have empowered women or women with access to information that they can then use for their own development purposes. And, for so many hundreds, if not thousands of interviews that I've done for the last 25 years, it comes back to, I'm worried my wife is going to have an affair. I worry she's going to get educated and leave me because I'm not educated. There are all these things that didn't come about because of the internet, but are so much more in people's range of fear because it's so much more immediate. So I talk to, mother-in-laws in Northern India who say things like, well, if I could just track where she is on her phone, I'd let her have the phone. And the women, maybe I would have an issue with privacy, but a lot of these women say, please turn on tracking. She'll see I go to the well, I go to my kid's school, I come back here. So can we use parts of the technology to actually build trust about women's use in technology? We've got to create compelling use cases, no matter what those are. Are those economic use cases? Are they children's health? What are the kind of palatable information streams that the community can benefit from immediately that can actually bolster and support women's use? I've talked a little bit about pairing with societal problems, but we really need to take a look at this backlash that's been happening and helping to grow the gender digital divide, which is the fear of online gender-based violence. It's the fear of the harassment, the stalking, the porn, the spam, et cetera, the cybersecurity, the cyber hygiene issues that, now I see a lot of efforts that could be funded that people say, you know what, we're not going to put those computers in that girl's school because they might be harassed. And that part of me just wants to cry and be like, we can handle that at the hardware level, the software level, the user level, the policy level. There are things we can do without just saying, we're putting women in sort of a digital purdah and they can't access this because it's for their own good. And in a lot of ways, that protectionist, thing is actually helping to create a larger gender gap and reinforce a lot of these gendered stereotypes. We really need to take a lesson from the gender and development orgs, the Women for Women Internationals, the CARES, the other organizations that have worked so long in gender and development and know what works and know how to engage with the power brokers in these communities, because technologists, and I'm guilty of this, come at this with a technology lens. We're going to go in there, we're going to bring a tech, we're going to bring an app, and it doesn't really matter that we're not gender experts, but it does, because this is why these things continue to fail. And for the real nerds on this call that are come from computer science, maybe you'll remember Conway's Law from 1967, which said that any technology we create is imbued with the values of the people creating it. And we're seeing that in all sorts of problems with AI and machine learning here in the States. So of course, we're going to see that in applications that you and I create for people that we are not. And then just some very obvious, solutions they're leading with, income and dignity generating opportunities. It's, I see so many applications with these interfaces that look too easy. They look dumbed down. It's like when someone goes and pays with a food card at the supermarket. Everyone knows they're paying with a SNAP card. Why isn't this thing designed to look like a MasterCard? Why are we making people feel less than when they're using digital development solutions? We really need to be aware that, dumbing down is not necessarily the right way to do it. We actually need to co-create with women. I've spent a lot of extra time and a lot of cycles where people have said, I won't use that interface. It doesn't make sense to me. It's in the wrong colors. I can't plug it into my waistband. So we really do have to design as if these poor people that we're trying to help are not charity cases, they're actual customers of the services that we can provide. And then of course, promoting the positive deviance. And by that, I mean both the deviants and deviants. So, men that take a stand and say, hey, I will absolutely let my wife and child use this. If we go to the next slide, let's see. Oh, I have a really good quote from a man. And I put the slides out of order, sorry. We will get back to the positive deviance in just a section. So the Women Connect Challenge, I don't want to talk too much about this because there's been a lot that's written about it. There's a website, et cetera, but it really is USAID's effort to look at the social norms and technology interaction where they inform each other and can create new on-ramps for women and communities to embrace empowerment opportunities vis-a-vis technology. So we have 9 projects right now. I'm lucky that Rebecca from IPA will be able to talk about one. But they're very interesting. The AFCHICS one was the one that I talked about, the community network model where women are bringing internet to the community for the first time. Molly Health has this wonderful text-free user interface social network where women can connect with each other all over the place. But because 98% of the women we're working with are illiterate, and the only language they speak is Bambara, which is not Unicode compliant and doesn't really have an actual online, standardized form, you've got 20 million speakers that if you have a verbal-based application, they're going to be able to use it. I could talk about these projects forever, but I won't, because we can talk about them offline. I will say that as many of these are rooted in practicality and creating these use scenarios, it's not that technology is dumbed down in this case. Certainly we're using a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning components in these projects. The creditworthiness that Rebecca is going to talk about. There's voice authentication in one of our projects in India, because what we found is that 30% of phones given to women are taken away or stolen or lost or just disappear. So if you can tie the use to the actual woman's voice, it won't work for anybody else. And that, we're studying to see if that ups the ownership level. Where we have our projects are below in those 12 countries. We also have a round 2 of Women Connect that had a higher award level to them. These projects are happening in Rwanda, Senegal, and Bangladesh. And then I'll be announcing a round 3 this summer sometime. So watch womenconnectchallenge.org, and I'll also make sure that it's posted to SID-W. Next slide. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to push it fast. And again, this just goes back to the fact, looking at the idea that, ICT for development is somehow just down-level computing for down-level people. And the fact is that as a technologist, what is most exciting to me are how many opportunities we have to really push the margins of technology when we're actually trying to work with those who are most marginalized by society. So here's just some examples of some of the things that these projects are using and pushing in terms of a research agenda that could be generalized to other projects, that could result in maybe a south to north transition, etc. So, when we hear people say things like, oh, the women will never be able to own a handset, they're too expensive, I can look at our project in Mozambique with our partners Gappy and Bluetown and say, we have a really interesting rent to own model. Here's how it works. So I'll go into any of these with anyone later on, but let's keep going to the next slide. And all these pictures are from Women Connect fieldwork and stuff. So if you like the pictures, good. I hope you like the pictures. This is my slide of the sort of positive deviant in this northern Nigerian community, where we're working with clerics, scholars, community leaders, and male heads of family to actually host these family-wide learning groups that you have a radio component, they have a PSA component, they have a meeting in person component, to really dispel myths about internet, the content, and to talk about what you do when you do run up against things that are against your values, and trying to find value-laden content that will actually be applicable to lives and livelihoods. So I just really like this quote. I won't read it out loud, but I really like the fact that, he's now giving handsets to his wives and their children to actually access the internet, when before this project he never ever would have let them do this. So it's one man, but it's also one man that's part of a group of 75 men who have multiple wives and multiple children. So you start advancing this out. I'm a huge fan of working at the grassroots and then scaling programs by promotion rather than by traction rather than promotion. So next slide. So what does this mean moving forward? What does this mean for people on the call, et cetera? I am a huge critic of how we actually count the women that are online and what they're doing. What is meaningful use? What does connectivity mean if you're in a country that only has 10% internet adoption for all genders? What does it mean to actually close a gender digital divide when there's even a much huger digital divide? What does it mean in communities where we can't access qualitative and quantitative data very well? What are good proxies? What are good approximations of this stuff? So I'm very focused on the monitoring and evaluation and learning of not just the Women Connect project, but trying to look at all of the stats that we use, from the ITU to GSMA to UNESCO, because everyone is counting this gender divide very differently and have very different results because of that. The big thing, though, is okay, we can find out what works, and we can come say, but who's going to read it? We have so many reports out there. We have so much information. So let me ask you offline is, how would you want to know about the findings of this? I can write a report and send it to the head of CSR or, head of diversity initiatives at Intel or Microsoft. I'm not sure they're going to, adopt any of these strategies just because USAID did 12 projects in this space. Although at the end of the day, these are the first, these are very, the findings from these, I think, really could reconceptualize how we even think about the gender digital divide and what we do with it. We need a better community of practice overall. Maybe this is another starting place with this, that, I work in this space as digital inclusion area. For some reason, we don't work very well with the digital financial services people. And we know that mobile money and women are sort of a whole different area, and they're not really counted into this gender digital divide because most women do have access to mobile money, but mobile money is not a gateway drug to using the rest of the internet. So we really need to close that circle between digital financial services and digital inclusion. We sit in different places and organizations, we have different donors, we have different communities of practice, and that's just ridiculous because these women are not sector driven, only we are. And also I'm seeing a lot of interest in this risk assessment and mitigation space about online violence, online harassment. If I'm sitting here pushing for people to, for more women to be online, and we have other organizations saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to come up with good messaging where that is. All of this, gender, social norms, et cetera, this is really a hard sell in digital development. This is what we call an evergreen issue. Gender and technology is something that we always bemoan. Literally, I've been doing this for 3 decades, and this is, we still haven't made a huge amount of progress. The nice thing is right now, it is a very busy time for this. We have the Me Too movement. We have the fact that a lot of these development initiatives that are moving to digital strategies probably will fail unless they take gender into account. So we better get on that ball now. We have things like the WGDP funding out of USAID and the US government, writ large, 13 agencies, putting big funding behind this. So we have to strike while the iron is hot. And then let's go back to my first slide, which is ask all the questions. There are no dumb questions in this space. There are only questions that we can discuss. I'm putting up my email address because if we go to slide 1, because I'd love to be in touch with any of these things, ideas you have, things that we don't have time to talk about on this. I see a note that says, yeah, a lot of vulnerable rural women don't even have access to mobile money. Absolutely true. I was making gross generalizations in our time frame here. So I would love to stay in touch with everybody. So could we go back to slide 1, please? Whoever's doing slides. No, slide 1. Whoop. One more. There we are. That's my email address. This is kind of all I do. This is my hobby. This is my life. This is what I care about most of all. So let's reconnect about some of these things. And if you want more resources, which will have a lot of the citations from the studies today, please go to revisterling.com. I'll be done. I'm excited to hear from Rebecca and from Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Revi. So we're going to do a poll to start Revi's presentation, and we're going to do one in the middle of Rebecca's and at the beginning of we're going to do one Jennifer's. Yes. We are having some technical difficulties right now, so we're trying to get the polling function back up. But for the first one. Revi, if you want to do that really quick before we end it, and we'll put it in the chat box for this one, and then we'll try to fix the polling feature. So hopefully the next one, for the next poll, we can make it work.
Sure, but I think you'll have the answers, which are.
That's true. That's
No, we covered it in the slide deck. Don't worry about it. Let's just move on to Rebecca.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Revi. You did just exactly what we asked you to do, and that set the stage. And more than that, I think you've gotten us all fired up. Fired up because it's just, you brought to the very forefront the injustice of it all. So it's not fair, but also what you really highlighted for me just now is the missed opportunities. We're missing out on tech solutions because women aren't involved. So you threw down the gauntlet. Let's keep the discussion going. Perhaps SID can serve as a nexus for bringing those fragmented groups together. And now we can turn to a positive example, one of the winners IPA of the round from the Women's Challenge, Women's Connect Challenge. Thank you. This is Rebecca Rouse, who heads the Financial Inclusion Program at Innovations for Poverty Action, IPA. She oversees a portfolio of research initiatives and randomized evaluations to find effective solutions to help the poor manage and increase their money. Before joining IPA, she was with the Multilateral Investment Fund, a member of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? You can give me a thumbs up? Perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much to SID-W and also to Ravi for inviting us to present today. And thank you everybody for joining. I'm happy to be doing this from my living room, and I'm glad I can reach so many people without leaving home. So I'm going to talk about our project that was generously funded by Women Connect Challenge. So thank you again. It's a project that we're doing in the Dominican Republic. So first of all, for those of you who don't know IPA, we're Innovations for Poverty Action. We are a global nonprofit research and policy organization based in the US, but we've got operations in 22 countries. And we partner with academic researchers to find out what works for international development and also what doesn't work and how we can improve it. So our project today is looking at ways that we can effectively use mobile phone data and new machine learning techniques to increase women's access to credit, specifically in the Dominican Republic where we're working. Oh, sorry, I just tried to advance the slide myself. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So like I said, we've got a ton of partners on this project. Our principal investigators, our academic partners are Josh Blumenstock, Laura Chioda, Paul Gertler, and Sean Higgins. We're implementing the project through Innovations for Poverty Action in the Dominican Republic. And then our financial institution partner is Asociación La Nacional, or ALNAP. And then we've got all these other funders and partners who are helping us along here. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the context of access to formal credit for women. And listening to Ravi's remarks, I wish I'd also looked up the mobile phone ownership rates for women in the Dominican Republic to look at that gap. Or I actually am not sure if there's a gap. I don't think it's as pronounced as in some of the other countries that Ravi was referring to, but it definitely exists still. But first of all, looking at access to formal credit. So you'll see overall, access to formal credit and access to any kind of credit, which could be, from a non-regulated institution, is still quite low across the board in the Dominican Republic, right? So this is data on credit access coming from the Global Findex from the World Bank from 2017. So first of all these questions are within the last year. Oh, I think we lost the slide. Bring it back up. So the first question was around whether or not in the last year people had access any kind of credit, formal, informal, to start or grow a business. Could you move it to the next slide? Thanks. So we see only 12% of men reported borrowing to start, operate, or expand a business. But then, so the 12% is striking, but then even more striking is that gap. So men here are in green and women are in gray. So we see, clearly women are lagging behind men in terms of borrowing for business development. And then if you ask about borrowing from any kind of formal financial institution in the last year, also quite low, but we still see a persistent gap. So 25% of men over age 15 reported that they had borrowed from a formal financial institution, but then 20% of women. And so this is for the Dominican Republic. You can pass the next slide. So, what's going on here? So obviously there's gender bias in lending, and there's gender bias in the credit approval process. So another study from a partner researcher from Chile looked at credit applications. This is quite recent. I think data is from 2019 or 2018. Credit applications from women were 12% less likely to be approved than applications from men who had the exact same borrowing profile, exact same credit scores. And then we see that if we slice that up into income groups, we see that that bias is even larger for lower income women. So for women in the study who were requesting amounts of less than $7,000 US, they were 20% less likely to be approved than men who had the exact same profile. So, what's going on here? Obviously, there's human bias. So if I'm sitting in front of a loan officer and the loan officer is looking at me, he could, visually check me out and say, well, I don't think this woman is serious. So obviously there's that human bias of having that person-to-person interaction. And believe it or not, we were talking with other researchers. I think in Uganda, there's a woman who's doing a study right now looking at bias related to body mass index and credit approvals for women, which is also, there's very obvious, social norms issues and bias happening there. So we think that technology should fix all this, right? If you're taking the human element, that human judgment out of the process, you should be looking only at people's data and then making better decisions, right? So move to the next slide. So here, I don't know, we don't have the polling, I don't know if we have the polling technology ready, but my next question to all of you was to be, what do you think about this? If we remove that human judgment, if we remove that loan officer who's sitting at the desk from the equation, are we removing bias? So in 1974, the US enacted the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which makes it illegal for any lender to consider sex when they're evaluating creditworthiness, right? Is this the right policy? Is this gender blind policy not requiring institutions to not consider gender at all? Does that ensure that women will receive equal treatment and you'll see, equal approval rates for the same profile? So that's a question for you guys, and I'm interested to hear what people think. Next slide.
So yeah, so just as a heads up, so we're still working on it, but it's still not working right now. So for everyone, if you could just post your answers to the question in the chat box, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
And this is kind of a trick question, so we can talk about it more in the chat, or feel free to let me know what you think about that. So where I'm going with this is that no, and I really liked what Revi said earlier, that the technology we create has the same values of the people who created it, right? So thinking about the kind of data that are feeding into decision-making processes for lending, among low-income borrowers especially, and especially for low-income women, there's still a lack of sufficient and appropriate data to feed into those credit application processes, right? And all of this is related to, prevailing social norms in whatever country that can even, make their way into regulation, into law. So, things might include not having a formal credit history, or being less likely to have a formal credit history, formal borrowing history. Women are more concentrated in informal jobs, might not have a way to prove their income in the same way that somebody who gets a salary could. Less likely to have assets to use as collateral, such as land, and there might be legal constraints there, where women might not even be able to, be the sole owner of an asset or something like that, right? So they can't show that to demonstrate that they've got collateral. And informal borrowing isn't necessarily recorded. So women might have perfect repayment rates, be very, very good candidates for a loan, have really positive repayment behavior based on other informal strategies that they're using, savings and loan, informal savings and loan groups, DSLAs, things like that. But that information might not be making it into the formal kind of credit reporting system, right? So if we're saying that we're going to make a lending decision just based on data, we already have a gap here of what kind of data is actually available. If a lender is requiring these types of data to feed into their decision making, women are already at a disadvantage because they are less likely to be able to provide that kind of data and feed that in. Next slide. Thank you. So this table just shows barriers to women's financial inclusion across the board, right? There's demand side barriers. Some of these I mentioned already, right? So lack of assets for collateral, lack of formal identification, concentration in lower paying economic activities and more informal work, lack of bargaining power within the household, which, you know, maybe an algorithm won't solve, but, you know, if they're not able to approach a financial institution in the first place, for whatever reason. And then one thing that I won't get into here, but I think, you know, Revi talked about a lot, is there's also lower rates of cell phone ownership. So for some of these new digital finance products that are coming on the market, you know, if I don't own my own phone, if there's one phone for the household, or, you know, my husband has the phone and I don't get to use it, or I just am, you know, it's just not culturally acceptable for me to use the phone, then obviously I'm not going to have access to those products. So kind of on the demand side, supply side, inappropriate product offerings, lack of gender specific policies, and then all the legal and regulatory barriers that that impact these other items, right? So account opening requirements that disadvantage women, barriers to obtaining identification, legal barriers to owning or inheriting property, and then lack of gender inclusive credit reporting systems. So all of these things, even if we take away, you know, the biased, you know, loan officer who's going to look at me and make a judgment based on what I look like, there's still constraints that women are facing on the data side. So they're not necessarily going to be getting the same treatment because they're not bringing the same data to the table. Next slide, please. Yeah, so basically algorithms can be biased too. So, you know, one of the great promises of digital finance is that, again, we're taking that human judgment out of the equation, but these existing credit scoring models that are used to predict credit risk might include gender, but they do so in a very superficial way. They are definitely not taking into account all the potential interactions between gender and some of the variables, some of these other data points that they're requesting, some of these things that I mentioned already, and the way that gender is going to impact, you know, how people look on those other data points. Yeah, and unfairly penalizing women for not being able to provide certain types of data, right? So this is a constraint, but new machine learning approaches can take these interactions into account in a way that you know, traditional scoring models haven't. Go to the next slide. So this brings me to the objective of our project in the Dominican Republic, which is, can we create a new model? Can we use machine learning to create a new model that does take gender into account? And this is going directly against what the regulation in the United States says, that we shouldn't consider gender at all when we're doing credit scoring or when we're evaluating borrowers. So what we're trying to show here is that, yes, you do have to take gender into account for all of these reasons in order to get a fair assessment. So this project is helping us, one, create a proof of concept. Does it matter? Is it important to be taking gender into account? And what's the effect once we do take gender into account in these new models? And then two, can we actually create a product that is going to be equally accessible to women, but that can use the right types of data to score women appropriately based on what they can provide and what kind of data that they can show? And is that, I guess, for, you know, what's interesting to the banks, is that enough to accurately predict whether or not these women are going to be good borrowers? And two, will this actually open up access to credit to a whole new pool of women who might have been denied under a more traditional credit scoring model? So next slide. So this is exactly just what I just said, right? So we are still in the process of implementing the project. So we've got these three phases first, right? Proof of concept. Is this actually important? Does this work? And can we learn something from disaggregating data, gender data, or disaggregating these two models? Do we come up with different results if we do take gender into account? And then two, can we, you know, how do we actually, how does the rubber hit the road? How do we actually turn this into a product that people can use? And then eventually we'll evaluate impact on downstream incomes or women's economic empowerment, business growth. So next slide. This is what we've done to date. Really focuses on that first proof of concept, right? So our beneficiaries are women in the Dominican Republic who own small businesses, might be informal. And our bank partner, again, is La Nacional. Dominican Republic does not have pure mobile money or digital credit in the same way that other countries, for example, Kenya do, where it's something that's like directly out of your mobile phone. The digital credit provider isn't necessarily a bank. In the Dominican Republic, these fintech apps are backed by banks who are actually doing the lending. The next slide. I'll try to run quickly through this. Next slide, because I think you probably can guess where I'm getting at right now. So our proof of concept. So what we've done so far, the first job that we had was trying to train a new model. Can machine learning accurately predict positive and negative repayment patterns? Does this actually work? So to create this proof of concept and test out this new model, we use data provided by La Nacional on users of their credit card, both men and women. So we fed data from over 7,000 credit card clients into our model. And we use methods such as random forest, which are more accurate than regressions. And I'm not an economist, I just play one, but I can kind of try to get into more detail about what that means if people have questions. So we looked at two things, right? So we looked at the pooled sample of men and women, and we tried to use this machine learning technique to replicate the credit approval process and see if we could accurately predict, one, if people were approved for the credit card, and then two, if they were going to be successful at repaying. And then we did two separate models where we separated out the men and looked if we could do the same thing with just men and then also with just women. So the data that got fed into this model was card approval and payment history, but then also we had demographic data on the users. The next slide. So I don't expect anybody to really be able to see the scatter plot, but this is the result. So the big takeaway here is that 81% of women in the women-only model got a better credit score by using that women-only model than they got when they actually applied for their credit card. So this implies that there was information that traditional model that the bank was using was not taking into account. So women who were good candidates to get the credit card, were being left out. People were scoring higher and were approved for higher credit amounts when we were separating out just the women from the men. So this credit scoring model that the bank is using was unfairly penalizing women because we could see that, if we looked at it on their own, they were actually going to do a lot better than what this traditional model was going to predict. So go to the next slide. So again, more women were approved for credit under the women-only model, and women qualified for larger loans. So we think that actually is because when the bank is looking at everybody on average, men were actually worse at repaying, and they were dragging the average down. So women were actually more likely to pay back the credit, and they could handle larger amounts. But when we're only looking at everybody on average, they were being unfairly penalized by the really poor repayment behavior of the men. So tells us that if we're looking at models, across the board, we could be giving women more credit. They're being unfairly penalized. Next slide. So this is as far as we've gotten so far. So our next step, well, one, I think we definitely, have figured out that this is the right thing to do. Differentiating by gender does matter. We need to take gender into account, and we need to create this gender differentiated model. So the next step is going to be to train a new model for a new fintech app that LNEP has developed using call records data. So this is our way of producing, using data that is produced equally by by both men and women who are using the app. And in other markets, it's a proven predictor of repayment and income. So this is what we're working on right now. So again, creating that gender differentiated model using call records data produced by this fintech app. And then eventually, once we get all the kinks and we've got kinks sorted out and we've got users online, we're going to conduct a randomized evaluation of that new model and look at the impact on some of these downstream welfare effects that we care about and the business development effects, to look at what the cost of excluding those women were, the cost of not giving them as much credit as they were applying for or deserved, what's the difference of opening up this new channel for women to, have more access to credit and also access to larger amounts of credit. So next slide. And just quickly, there's a lot of use for this. It's not just our project in the DR. Mobile phone data is being used to predict creditworthiness everywhere. A lot of these newer startups like Tala and Branch, folks who are getting a lot of attention, Mshwari in Kenya, as these guys are getting a lot of attention as the leaders on digital lending, but they're not using the data in the way that we're proposing, right? So, once we kind of figure out what the true impact is here, we're going to have a really solid case to bring to other lenders like the Mshwaris of the world to say, look, this is the way that gender, this is why gender matters. This is why it's not enough to ignore gender. If you're saying you're ignoring gender, it's impossible because it's, gender and social norms are impacting everything, everything about, the type of the way that data is fed into these systems and, what kind of data is produced and how, how many people we can reach and what types of people we can reach. So this is why we think that this project is going to have a larger impact just beyond Dominican Republic and the work that we're doing with our partner there. So you can go to the last slide. This is my contact information. Please do reach out if you're interested in learning more. If you've got, similar projects where you think this might be a useful tool, we're always happy to do matchmaking with our academic partners to try to figure out how we can incorporate testing into whatever work you're doing. So please do reach out, and thank you again for the opportunity to talk about our project.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Rebecca. I found that really interesting, this model, and I can't wait to hear more. I hope that you let us know the time frame for the results after your randomized evaluation. I would encourage anyone who has a question to enter it into the chat feature. One thing that stands out in my mind, Rebecca, about the work you're doing at IPA is, yes, women are losing out, but banks are losing out too. It looks like there's this whole market that they're just overlooking by being gender blind. Paul, do we have another poll?
Yes, we do. That is the next slide. Should be. Yep.
Okay, great. Why don't we go to the poll and then I'll introduce Jennifer. Does that sound good?
Yes, Jennifer, do you want to, since it's your question, do you want to introduce the poll?
So I actually sent you guys a bunch of questions. So I'm not sure if this was the one about, if I was interested from kind of the whole talk, how many people had really heard about the gender digital divide before. So is that the question that we pulled up?
Yes, it should. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, so I guess, so if you want to go ahead and read it, because I'm not sure.
Yes. So the question is, before this talk, had you heard of the gender digital divide before?
Great.
Okay, we'll give it a minute or two for people to respond to it.
I think later, if you have time for another question, it would be really interesting to know if people feel like they have the tools they need to kind of assess gender when they're doing projects that involve technology. But I won't overly complicate things yet.
Duly noted. Okay, I guess that's enough time. It looks like most people have said yes.
Ah, okay. So
few no's, but just briefly scanning, it looks like most people, like vast majority, said yes.
great, excellent. Okay, so, sorry.
Are we
think-
ready to go? I can say a couple of words of introduction, Jennifer.
Sure.
Jennifer Johnson works for SID, a woman-owned and woman-led social enterprise that makes learning radically accessible through its mobile platform. Take note, radically accessible. Jennifer, I hope you give a good example of what that means. I'm looking forward to hearing it. SID was developed to fill a global skills gap that is overwhelmingly female, and she will discuss how human-centered design in the SID experience has resulted in designing to meet the needs of low-income women. Prior to working with SID, Jennifer has worked with many important organizations in international development, and you can find her full bio on the SID-W website. Jennifer?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I know, Paul, we have to keep it moving along. So I am going to maybe ask you to skip over slides that we would normally just do. So anyway, again, thanks a lot for the time and thanks for the platform. We do think this is a really important issue at SID, and so huge thanks to SID-W for putting this together. My name is Jennifer Johnson, and I help SID grow their strategic partnerships, particularly in international development, as that's my background. So next slide. So this always comes up, so I need to, so we are basically a mobile, SID is a mobile learning solution. Basically, you can learn all kinds of things just through your phone, or a tablet, or a computer. But we really try to be radically accessible, so that's why you see a smartphone, but also a flip phone. And we are now rolling out on WhatsApp because that's so heavily and commonly used. And there are lots of different things you can learn with SID. Next slide. I have to kind of explain how it works because that will always become the question. But what happens is if you have a smartphone, you would download the app. You would take a quick little quiz to kind of put you into the right level of your course. And then that's off some lessons that you can take on your phone. And they're all about 3 to 5 minutes and very interactive. So that's why you see on this slide that there's a lot of back and forth. Having the lessons short was really important. And there's a gendered part of that as well. Really concerned about women's time and the time poverty of women. So next slide. So we work across, you can do a SID lesson on a flip phone, a tablet, almost anything. And the way this works is, let's say you're somewhere in Africa, and instead of making a phone call, you just send a text, which makes a callback happen, and then your lesson starts. So you're just listening to the audio on your phone where you have a lesson going, and then texts come back and forth that are either more information or prompts. So as you can see here, this is something from I think a financial literacy course. So that's basically how the technology works. You're just listening to audio lessons and sending and receiving text. So next slide. We work only through NGOs, so we don't go direct to learners, we go through partners. So we work with NGOs around the world to kind of help them reach more learners, kind of really helps them scale their work. And so the other piece of it is that the NGOs we work with get all this kind of great back-end data. This is just a screenshot from one of our databases. So, so this is kind of information that we're able to collect on the back and do some good analysis. So next slide. So we are now committed to filling the global skills gap. Next slide. Sorry, these are faster. But our original design back in 2011 was with a woman who was really interested in how do we improve maternal literacy. She really saw that as a key development driver for kind of pushing other development factors forward. But she also saw that maternal literacy work was poorly funded. There were a lot of gaps. It was moving slowly. So it was really a place that was ripe for disruption and an area where you could consider using technology. So this woman was a brain researcher, actually. So she was interested in using technology But it needed to also, the other part of it, kind of like what Revi was talking about, where it's the technology, but it's everything else that is so important as well. It can never be just the technology. And in deciding what to use for the tech, it really had to be accessible, ideally something people already have, especially women. Next slide. So when they went through the whole design process, they had to think about something that was more widely available, mobile phones, but it was also really simple to use, right? So rather than a complicated interaction with a mobile phone, it had to be simple. So something like that's just calling and texting. And what they liked about mobile phones is that they also overcame a lot of the barriers that women face to learning. I mean, even in the United States, but especially around the world, if a woman wants to learn, she's got to, in the traditional way, get up from whatever she's doing, find the transportation and the means to get to a class that hopefully fits her needs. And so frequently that's not the case. She's so busy with childcare. She's maybe got several jobs, or, you know, if you think about the out-of-home work, the in-home work, they have so much going on, or there are so many cultural barriers to women just traveling. So we needed something that would really overcome those barriers. And there was a lot of interest in how, again, the woman who developed this was interested in how people learn. So when you use a cell phone, you can produce kind of these short little lessons. There's this immediate real world feedback because you're texting. And it's also this concept of individual learning, right? So if you're learning on a computer and it's a lesson, it's really a lesson that's coming to you, and it's also coming to lots of people. But on a phone, it can be this very individual experience, especially if you have a lot of power over choosing kind of what's next and what you take next, and what lesson you might take next. So next slide. So they designed this CEL-Ed design where you could learn on just using the call and text features of a basic mobile phone. They pulled together the whole design, but they needed to test it. So there was an RCT that was done with Oxford University, UCLA, and Tufts. Looks like the slide got a little messed up there in the send over. But the question for the test, for the pilot study, was, can we teach literacy using just the call and text features of a flip phone? And what they did was take 70 Spanish-speaking adults in Los Angeles. Over 3/4 of them were female. The mean age was 48, and they had to have very low literacy levels. And they sought to just try to teach them literacy in just 4 months. So that was the test. And next slide. And they had great results, which is kind of what then launched CEL-Ed. So they saw that after just 4 months of using this very basic way of teaching people, they saw 2 to 4 years of literacy gains. These are two of kind of the main scores in terms of reading. And then next slide. They also saw that there was a real change in self-esteem and self-efficacy. And this was important because it speaks to what Revi was talking about before, that everybody, but especially women, need to know that they can learn. They need to be encouraged and pushed and moved along, because for so many of the women, certainly in this pilot, but that we want to reach around the world, they don't believe they even have the ability, because they've really never been given the opportunity, or they didn't have the right kind of class. So we know that checking people's kind of self-esteem and their self-efficacy is important, and they luckily saw good improvement with the pilot with that. Next slide. So now CEL-Ed works in different sectors, and we have different partners around the world. But kind of the questions that are really relevant to gender are, is that design that is the short lessons, that is available via cell phone, that is only used with call and text, is that design still actually working for women? And next slide. So some of what the evidence we can collect is that it is. And in the original pilot study, they posited that it's the flexibility that was breaking down the barriers for women to learn. that if they could learn when they wanted, for as long as they wanted, in short bursts, right? Not long time commitments, because women have like 5 minutes while they're waiting for a pot to boil, that it could really make a difference. And we can see from some of our analysis on the back end that if you look at this top line here, and that's text messaging interactions by time of day. So our back-end system can kind of analyze that and see that this is when people are learning. And we can see when they're learning during the day. So we use that to kind of make sure the system is really working well for our learners. And they're interacting with it for short periods of time because, you know, these are women's lives. And then we do kind of pull when they give us feedback about the system, that's part of what that is. Next slide. The other really important part of this is that, you know, everyone, adults, but it's especially true for women, they need the real life relevant skills right now. So it's something you can do today, not someday. So we're able to track the skills that they gain. And we know that this kind of keeping it relevant is really important. So that's like a theme throughout everything at CELED, right? It's the technology, but it is it's what is the actual development goal. And so the content is just as important. Next slide. So, and this is what I'm saying, right? It's the mobile part is first, but it's not mobile only. So one part of CELED is that a lot of our content is locally produced. So for example, we have a project in Eswatini, reaching adolescent girls and young women. That lesson is a script, and it's these women having conversations that include a young woman, but it's all in their vernacular, in people speaking in their language. And the girls and young women have really connected with this program because it really feels like it's talking to them, right? It's not some random American voice like mine. These are women from their community, women and girls from their community, and they can understand and relate to the audio content, to the trainers that they hear on the phone. You have to keep looking at what the complete solution is, right? So the technology matters, but this is, you know, technology for development. So we have to really think about their lives when whatever we're designing. And if I have people out there who are looking at designing something, it's the technology, but it's everything else. And you always have to be thinking about people's lives. Next slide. So kind of going forward for CELED is that there is, we have to meet learners where they are, right? So it's, when it started in 2011, it was flip phones. More people are now using, able to access smartphones, but this awesome little yellow phone in the middle is a Nokia phone that operates the ConfiaMas operating system, which is a really light operating system that is going to bring the operability of smartphone technology really down to a lower, you know, the 2G, 3G world. So some Nokia phones, ConfiaMas phones, the banana phones as we call them, come loaded with CELED, and we're testing that out now. And we're rolling out on WhatsApp, right? Because if people are on WhatsApp, if that's where we are, that's where we need to teach them. So, you know, again, technology needs to come to the learners. The learners shouldn't have to come to the technology. It really should be about where they are. Next slide. And if we look into the future about what we're doing, so again, it's the technology. Those are great. It's great that we have the banana phones, and it's great that we're working out WhatsApp, but also the programming needs to stay really connected with women and young girls' lives, women and girls' lives, and where they are and what they need. So one thing we're seeing right now is that in some of the populations that we're working with, there's already some concerns about children who are not able to go to school. Other issues around child abuse at home, not having the structure that school provides. So that partner is asking us to develop something very quickly that helps them address kind of some of the early repercussions of COVID-19 with their groups. And then the other thing that we're working on going forward, World Education has been one of our really great partners. Discovery Learning, now called Impact Ed, is another. A lot of great partners, but with World Education, we're doing this really interesting work in Eswatini, where we're reaching girls with a kind of building their social assets curriculum, and we're building a GBV screening tool because we know that girls report gender-based violence, but if you're going to speak to them directly about it, they can't talk about it, right? It all suddenly goes away. So is there a way through using kind of the more, that's kind of using behind the veneer of a phone, that we can both allow girls to report in a really safe way and also get them the tools they need? So that's just something we're exploring and working on with World Ed, and we're developing out the remote M&E portion of what we do, just because that's becoming such a need right now. So next slide. So I guess the main thing is, you have to keep learning too, right? If you're with a startup, that entering these different prizes and doing these different competitions, it allows other organizations to use your technology and give you more feedback, and it allows you to kind of keep learning and keep revising how things need to be designed. Next slide. I think that's it. Sorry, I wanted to make sure that we had enough time for questions and all of that, so I will wrap it up right there.
Great, thanks Jennifer, and thanks to all speakers for your time. I know we only have a few minutes. Maybe we can provide a little bit more time for questions if need be. But we will address, I guess, audience questions now. So feel free, if you haven't done so already, to add any to the chat box. I know we have a few from during the presentations that we will get to. So I guess we can start with those and then move on. So for those of you who are asking questions too, if you want them to be addressed to a certain speaker, please let us know. Otherwise, we will assume that you are addressing it to the entire panel. And with that, let me ask the first question, which is, what do you think should be different in the assessment model? That wasn't addressed to anybody in particular.
Is this like assessment model? Are we thinking about, I'm not sure if this would be assessment for project design or assessment for monitoring and evaluation.
Didn't say. That's
okay. All right. So my 2 cents would be kind of touching on what Revi said earlier, is that it's the women who are not maybe there, who are not showing up, and that you need to be thinking about gender as much as anything else. You need to be really thinking about women's lives to ensure that, let's say you're trying to assess a new technology that you want to use, how is that actually working in women's lives or not? And sometimes the sad reality is everything you created is not actually going to reach the people you want to meet. So if we can start off with asking women what they need and then design from there, that would be better. I don't know, Revi, do you have more to say about that?
I mean, on my end, it's mostly just, we just need better assessment across the board, because the problem is we do these, we'll have one project, like maybe it's Jennifer's in Eswatini, or it's the IPA one in Dominican Republic, or it's, various Women Connect ones. And, the problem is because for the most part, the ends are so small, we don't get good generalizable data. So, we really do need, I think, a better set of reporting metrics for impact metrics, et cetera, that we can apply towards all gender and digital divide programs. And I really, that's something I've been really noodling for about the last year on, and there's kind of a group of us that both in academia and sort of the NGO space that are sort of noodling on this. So if you do care about the MEL side of this and building impact metrics, we haven't made much headway, but eventually we are going to need a better system that we can apply to any project in the gender digital divide space, because right now you look at a study and you can find 6 contradictions to it and 4 to support it. So that's where I would say that on the the analysis and side we are lacking.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for your responses. So the next question, so let's see here. So one thing I struggle with in fintech models is the question of unintended, looks like there were some spelling with some issues with that, but looks like it's consequences. Something like a microcredit has criticism attributed regarding putting the extra burden on women while the money they borrow is actually being used by men. Just packaging the burden in a different way with unintended consequences of credit scores. Women are considered better credit payers, and the question of having them having the extra burden of borrowing from men. How do we control this, or how do you control for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right, this model doesn't address that at all. So, I mean, women are, facing constraints everywhere. And if you remember the slide that I showed that had all of the different barriers to, economic empowerment or financial inclusion, one of them was intra-household bargaining power. That's a big one. And it's been well documented that, women take out loans that are not meant for them and that are meant for somebody else in their household, or, even if they were meant for them, might be kind of taken away by somebody else in the household, maybe a man, a husband, or a parent, or something like that. So absolutely. I mean, some of the things that we're looking at outside of this project are trying to address that. So we work with a researcher, Nathan Fiala from University of Connecticut, who's done a lot of work on this intra-household bargaining power question. Some lab in the field games where we ask women, would you rather have, say, $10 and it's just for you and we don't tell anybody that we gave it to you, or would you rather have $100 and it's to you and your husband? And the majority of women are going to go for the smaller amount because as long as it's just for them. So we're doing some testing around products that enhance privacy and control. And honestly, the digital financial products do a good job at that. You're not going to pick up a disbursement in cash and bringing the cash home to the house. People don't necessarily know how much money you got paid from your job or from a cash transfer. That element of privacy and control seems to be something that women really value. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to experiment with DFS to see how we can build that into products. Of course, there are always going to be unintended consequences there. And I think that's why this type of rigorous testing and evaluation is really important, because I don't want to go out and say, like, the key to everything is for women to keep all of their income secret or private from their husband or try to hide it. That can create a whole host of other issues, intimate partner violence, a lot of things, right? So I think the key here is to really understand the preferences of the customer, and then try to design around that, but also, incorporating really careful monitoring and evaluation across the board to be able to check out for some of these unintended consequences and make sure that we're actually fulfilling the needs and desires of the customer. Because it's true. I mean, these are development interventions, but ultimately we're producing products for a market segment. So we want to make sure that we're giving people what they actually want. If they and if this is a way for women to have greater control over loan proceeds or income or whatever, fantastic, let's give it to them. But we want to be really careful also.
Okay, great. So this next one is for Jennifer, or I'm just scrolling through my chat box. Where's Rebecca? Okay, so Carol would like to hear how SID has worked to link people to the workforce.
Yeah, so we do a lot of that. So a couple ways. Sometimes workforce asks us to come in and train people. But generally when we're training people, the projects that we have through our implementing partners, usually the plan is to get people into the workforce. So part of the design is, how does the skills you're learning now, how does that lead to the job that you want? So yes, and we do it in different ways depending on kind of the country and the project, but there needs to be we want a tangible outcome more than, oh great, I've got a great new set of skills, right? This has to make your life better in some way. And with our partners that are using, for example, labor unions in the United States are using us, and they're seeing a lot of good evidence around, they have a certain set of skills that are a gap. SID helps them fill that gap, and then people can go on to the better job or the next job. So, and I don't have that data right now, but it's definitely helping people get better jobs or a job.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Okay, next, I guess we'll go through and try to address these as many as we can in the next couple of minutes. Okay, so this is for Rebecca. Elizabeth is Elizabeth's asking about the timing for the evaluation of the model. That's all it says. I guess Elizabeth, if you want to elaborate too.
Like what the right timing is. I mean, I'll say for if you're talking about doing a randomized evaluation, randomized control trial evaluation of any intervention, you really need to be thinking about that from the very beginning, at the moment that you're actually designing the intervention. It's not something where you know, it's easy necessarily to come in after a product has already been launched or after a program is already happening, and then decide that you want to do a rigorous evaluation, because there's a lot that goes into it, thinking about the randomization and control groups and things like that, and how's that going to work. So the earlier the better. I mean, even from the initial design process of the product.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca, I was asking about when the results from your evaluation would be available.
That's a great question. I actually am not sure. We're in the process of building out the FinTech app part of it. So I do think it's kind of, it's going to be a long while until we actually get results of the impact evaluation. Obviously, outcomes like economic empowerment, income generation and stuff like that also take time to observe. So yeah, not in the short term, but we'll have kind of interim results, and we'll try to share those out as they become available.
Okay, great. Next question. This is for the whole panel. How is having access to the internet and digital services a financial challenge for women, i.e. installing Wi-Fi towers in rural areas or paying for the for internet and purchasing digital devices, which can be expensive?
Yeah, I can just say quickly, you know, in relation to the project that I just presented, you know, again, this isn't a solution for every problem, right? And so, yes, we can capture, you know, novel data from mobile phone usage from women who own the phone and are the sole users of that phone, of that mobile device. And, you know, that's great, a great, you know, opportunity for those women, but what about the women who don't own the phone? So, you know, there's other things that we're working on right now with pay-as-you-go products for mobile phones, and I want to say in Mexico right now. You know, there's innovative financing tools to expand access, but the social norms constraints that are still going to affect who gets to operate the phone, whose data is it actually recording, you know, and stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely, that's a constraint.
Ravi, you're on mute.
Thank you. Because cost can be such an issue, I think there are some very interesting things that we keep seeing more of. The fact that you have community networks, which are these community-led, community-managed, you know, community-set ISPs in places where a mobile network operator is never going to have a competitive advantage to go. You know, you can do a lot of free and subsidized Wi-Fi in these communities. With the 4 that are going on as part of the Women Connect Challenge, one is free, one is subsidized. The communities are making, you know, the women are figuring out themselves what the value of this network is and what they should pay. The one in Senegal says that every family has to pay $5 a month for, you know, unlimited access to a Wi-Fi network. So they're setting their own rates. There are creative rent-to-own models, use as you go, using different associating different SIM cards with different users. Obviously, one thing that's interesting is, you know, a lot of organizations and countries are trying to close this handset divide. So if you look at someplace like Chhattisgarh in India, you know, is giving away 5 million smartphones to the 5 million poorest women in the state. Now, I don't know how, I mean, I've read their metrics on how they define who the 5 million poorest women are, you know, but there are these grand schemes and initiatives to try to close some of these divides. Now, to what degree they're successful, to what degree men take the phones, that's the state where we have the voice activated system for the women. So I think we have to be very creative about some of these things. The KaiOS, the phone that Jennifer was talking about, that operating system is fabulous. It's a $12 phone that basically runs like a low feature smartphone. I also think there's a huge thing that we don't look at, which is all the custom hardware and software and systems like Amplio networks, Talking Book, some of the reading devices, et cetera, that are out there that aren't a mobile phone. And that's going to be so much more scalable. If you have one Talking Book, which is this device that doesn't even look like a book, it looks more like a hut. If you look at it from Amplio networks, I'm a huge proponent of putting that in communities that are off the cellular and electrical grid, but still have all the same information needs, if not more, than a lot of underserved communities. So community radio is still, basically Africa's internet in a lot of places, other community media forms. So we have to just be more creative in this space.
Sorry, and then from the CELED perspective, I mean, cost was a driver in the design, right? So that's why you don't need Wi-Fi, you just need access to a cell phone to call and text. Now, we know that in the developing world, that in itself is super expensive, right? So as it is now, we partner with an organization, and the costs of the calling and texting are usually borne by the donor at first, but then we look at ways of trying to make it more sustainable after we get once we've been going. And frankly, being able to roll out on WhatsApp is a huge change, because WhatsApp has just been able to make using their service more affordable than so many other services. So we kind of have to really use the technology to figure out how we can make this as affordable as possible.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So I know we're out of time, and I know there's still a few more questions left. But feel free, as we done intentionally, all the speaker information in terms of their email addresses are listed in the slides. And if Jennifer, Revi, and Rebecca feel comfortable sharing the slides, we can do that. If that's okay, great. So we'll make sure to share the slides with all of you, so that way you have contact information and for the speakers, and you're able to reach out to them in the future. But in any event, we'll just wrap it up here, and thank everyone for coming today and hearing from Rebecca, Revi, and Jennifer on this very important, on the gender and the digital divide. We really appreciate your patience as we work through some of the technical difficulties today. But as a last little wrap up, we are one of my interns is going to drop a question into the chat, last question in the chat box about just how you felt overall about the event. So if you could we really appreciate your feedback. We'll also send another brief survey for you all to fill out if you appreciate it. But she should be putting it in there right now. Yes, there it is. Please reply privately to the account. So if you feel more comfortable doing it that way, just about overall event satisfaction. So thank you again.